there is a really high chance of seeing the northern lights again tonight. So I'm going to teach you how to photograph them. This is one I took last night. So first of all, what are the northern lights? It happens when charged particles from the sun interact with the Earth's atmosphere as a result of a solar storm. The particles are carried to the Earth by solar winds, which then hit the Earth's atmosphere. And then they collide with gases like oxygen and nitrogen, giving us the most incredible light show. It's measured by something called the KP index, which is the measure of geometric activity. And it's on a scale between 1 and 9, 1 being the lowest level of geometric activity and 9 being the highest. And last night it hit 9 and currently it's like 8.33. So there is a chance that we're going to see something tonight. So if you're taking photos of the aurora with your iPhone, there is a lot of AI involved in that. If you have your phone on auto and you took a photo last night, you'll see it takes about 2 seconds to take that photograph. And you get a clear picture even if you're photographing it with just your hand alone. This is because the iPhone does something called stacking, which allows you to get a really clear image even on a longer exposure, like this one from last night. But if you want to photograph using your camera, there's a few things to consider. The first one, again, being the exposure. So to photograph the northern lights, I recommend having a longer exposure, again around 2 to 3 seconds, which means you need to use a tripod because otherwise your image will be very blurry. I recommend using a very sturdy tripod, and if possible, if you have a remote trigger, use that as well to avoid any movement. If you don't have a remote trigger, I recommend setting your camera on a timer for around maybe like 3 to 10 seconds. So when you start to take the exposure, you can just press the button, walk away, your camera will then stabilise before it takes the photo. And if you don't know what a longer exposure means, it means the camera shutter is open for a lot longer, which allows more light to pass through. The next thing to consider is aperture, which refers to the amount of light that is allowed to pass through the lens onto the sensor or onto film if you're shooting film. And this is measured in f-stop. So the lower the f-stop, the wider your aperture will be. The best way to describe aperture as well is think of your pupils. The wider your pupils, the more light is going through. So if you're in a really bright place, your pupils close a little bit to protect your eyes. It's the same thing, but with a camera lens. So the goal is to get as much light through the lens as possible hitting your sensor or film. So you need a very wide aperture. So last night I was shooting around f2. If you can go lower than that, then brilliant. And the third thing to consider is your ISO, which is your film or sensor sensitivity. This is where you have to be quite careful because the higher the ISO, the grainier your image will be. So really test your camera just to see how it looks. I photographed mine on ISO 1000 and this is one of the images that came from that. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is focusing. Don't be afraid to experiment with this. A lot of people say set your focus point to infinity, which can sometimes, believe it or not, actually be a bit too much. Now, I know it's hard, but the best thing to do if you just want to photograph the northern lights in all their glory is focus in on the stars. Also set your camera to manual focus, otherwise it will likely struggle to do this. But also don't be afraid to experiment on focusing on things in the foreground, like this one. You can also take your camera flash out as well. Last night I completely forgot it because I was so excited, I was in such a rush. So instead I used the torch on my phone. So how I took this picture, I'm just going to talk through it really quickly. So again, I focused on the church. I set it to, I think it was around a 2 or 3 second exposure for this one. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was one of those two. Focusing on the church, pressed the shutter. So obviously it was taking the photo, and then I got my phone, the torch on my phone, and shone it at the church for like a second and then stopped. And then this is how we got the lovely detail and highlights in the church here. You can see on this one there is a natural light source coming from the back and from the side, but there was nothing coming from the front. This church was pitch black from the angle that we were looking at it. So if you have extra lighting, don't feel afraid to experiment with it. And this is another one from last night as well. So be on the lookout tonight. Get your hot chocolate, get your chairs, get your pillows, get your cameras, and go out and just have a great night waiting for the Northern Lights. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments.